appreciate that. Mr. Shalek, you've discussed the selection process. Many of you haven't, so I assume you'll answer, but others are certainly welcome too. What are the key factors to consider when you're choosing early voting sites?
Accessibility to the most residents we can find.
Okay, thank you. Earlier you said your one consideration was increasing geographic diversity.
Correct.
Right?
Absolutely.
And what's the role of COMAR? Do you have to comply with COMAR?
Yes.
Okay, great. COMAR lists 10 criteria that were spelled out very clearly by the AELR committee that passes regulations for the state of Maryland. I haven't seen geographic diversity in here. They've put a lot of thought into this. They've rejected a lot of other things. I assume they rejected the idea of great geographic diversity as a criteria and passed these 10. Do you see geographic diversity in those 10?
I don't recall, but I don't dispute that. But our goal was geographic diversity. The sites that we were given to consider had already been vetted for complying with COMAR. We have counsel and a staff that vets all these sites to comply. They give them to us to consider. We don't get it if it doesn't comply a site with COMAR.
Mr. Hucker, may I respond to that as well?
Mr. Vint, please.
When you look at COMAR, it provides a list of what factors you shall consider, but it doesn't say that those are the only factors to consider. It is a list that you must consider, but there are other considerations. If the legislature wanted to write it differently and say these are the only considerations that you may consider, then I think your argument would have some merit that geographic diversity can't be considered. But I don't think they wrote it that way. They wanted some minimal legal requirements to be met. I think we met those, but I think all the board members would agree that there are other considerations that can be taken into account.
You think all these sites meet all 10 plus the geographic diversity thing that you, on your own authority, added to the list, right? Is that clear?
I didn't add it to the list. What I'm saying, Councilman Hucker, is that this list is only legal requirements. It doesn't speak to other considerations that the board should take into account when deciding on an early voting site.
Granted, but so you think all 10 comply with COMAR plus meet your goal of increasing geographic diversity?
As best we
I understand
can, yes,
okay.
I do. Yes.
Okay, that's helpful for clarifying that. Yes, Ms. Keefe.
I'm just always amazed at this discussion on geographic diversity. Voting is about people, and we should be looking at sites as to where the population exists. Simply looking at a map and covering area in terms of geography is not what we're all about.
Right. I mean, I assume you didn't consider Boyd's and Bealsville and Poolsville as alternate sites as well.
Mr. Hucker, if I might.
May I finish?
Yeah.
And certainly, like, if you had considered, because that would increase geographic diversity, but those are very remote communities where not many people live. In addition, if you look at, large and significant communities that have asked for a voting site and do not have one, like Tacoma Park or North Bethesda, that would obviously, increase the number of people that had access to a site. But anyway, that hasn't come up to.
Our selection process was limited by what we got from council and the staff. They gave us a list.
You're not able to add a site to the staff recommendations?
We tried to get Leisure World.
These were all staff recommendations you're acting on.
Yes.
Okay.
The initial list. Yeah.
And your
Leisure
World,
limited by it.
you're saying you don't have the authority to add one and reject
we
one.
can.
Okay, thank you.
Can I just
Mr.
speak to that for a
Nana,
second?
can you
First of
clarify?
all, Leisure World was added to the list by Mr. Shalek, and I totally agree that it was certainly worthy of consideration. But I disagree with the idea that we should completely rely on the staff's vetting. I personally believe that it is our job to oversee the staff's vetting. I know we have time issues today, but my own belief is that the staff's vetting of the Brookville site was horribly inadequate, and that there's some real question as to whether it meets the criteria.
Thank you. Yeah, I have a few questions about Praisner and the Longwood Center. But first, I still want to, and I apologize for being new at understanding this. Mr. Schaller, Mr. Vincent, you're new on the board as well. Could you walk me through the process? I assume this list comes from the testimony that you've had at the public hearing and from stakeholders that you've talked to. Did the board ever meet with nonpartisan groups that are very focused on voter participation, like Common Cause or the NAACP?
No,
or the
we-
League of Women Voters?
No, but we listened to whoever submitted information. We had a number of emails sent to us. People came to our meeting, legislators, and we had a public hearing, so we listened to everybody.
Thank you. I appreciate you mentioning my letter. I'm glad you read it.
Sir,
so-
we never did that before. We
Okay.
never did what you're talking from previous board. We never meet with every single people and ask them their opinion,
Okay.
for record.
And who else? Have you met with elected officials about what choices you should make for early voting sites?
Yeah, two members here gave us compelling
Some of us sent you letters, right?
letters.
What about party
Cheryl Kagan.
officials? Have you had a conversation with leaders of the Republican Party or the Democratic Party of the county?
Republican Party, sure.
How did that go? When was that meeting?
No, not a meeting. I've spoken to them, though, on the phone.
On the phone?
Yeah.
Was anybody else, who was on the phone?
Well, I spoke to the county chairman, and vice chairman. I've spoken to members of the Central Committee.
Were other
Republican
members
Central
of the
Committee.
board on the phone?
No,
Just you?
yes.
Have other members talked to leadership of the county Republican Party? Or the state Republican
No,
Party?
there may have been one call where we had a number of us were on the call, if I recall.
And when was that?
I don't recall.
And who do you recall was on the call?
Michael Higgs, the chairman of the party.
Michael Higgs was on the call, and which members of the board?
Was everybody on the call? Our side? Were you on the call?
No, I wasn't.
Were you on the call?
Yeah, I think I may have been on the call, Mr. Hucker. And I also wanted to add that we did hear
And
from
Ms.
League of Women
Kozame,
Voters.
you weren't on that call with
No.
Michael Higgs?
No,
And
but I
Ms.
see Mr. Hicks socially, but
Mhm.
not,
And Ms. Phillips, were you on that call?
Yes,
You were on the call.
I was, yes.
And any of the other members of the board were on the call or not? Were you
I
invited?
was not invited to
You were
that
not
call.
invited to that call. So three members of the board were on a call with the chair of the county party
Yes.
to discuss strategy about early voting center siting.
Not strategy, just to discuss it with them. I went to the Central Committee. I've talked to the Republican Central Committee. I'm sure the Democrat members have gone to their Central Committee, too.
Were the other members invited on that call and didn't participate?
Mary Ann and David?
Yeah.
No.
they
They weren't
didn't
invited.
invite us to their
Mr. Naaman?
Yeah, may I comment, please?
Yes.
First of all, we have, during the time that we were in the majority, we never had a conversation such as the one that Mr. Shalek is describing with the group of us on the phone with our party officials. What makes it particularly irritating in this instance is that the Republican Party had the opportunity to testify at our public hearing so that we could have heard their views. Maybe we would have heard that they wanted to do away with an early voting site in Bethesda and Burtonsville. We didn't get that opportunity because they didn't come to the hearing. And the idea that they didn't have to come to the hearing because they get their own private meeting with the majority of the board is something that we didn't think we were allowed to do. One of the reasons why we had a split vote 2 years ago was because we didn't have those kinds of conversations where we could work things out among ourselves. We thought that was not, that was not permitted. What's also interesting to me is that the chair of the Republican Party, Mr. Higgs, is a political appointee of the governor. The vice chair of the Republican Party, very nice woman, she works in the appointments office of the governor, which is the office that determines whether we get reappointed. I don't know what the nature of that conversation was like, but I would have been happy to participate if I had been asked. But I find it very disturbing. Well, I would have been happy to participate if it complied with the open meetings law. But I find it very disturbing that that would be where, the decisions are made. Maybe that's where the careful deliberation was that Mr. Shalek referred to earlier.
Ms. Kozame, were you invited onto that call?
No, I'm going to correct him.
You were not.
Mr. Hicks is not
Ma'am, you were not
appointee
in-
by Larry Hogan. He's not an appointee. He works there. He applied for a job. He got the job. It's nothing to do with Mr. Larry Hogan. I mean, Governor Hogan. I just want to correct that point.
Can I just say something?
He
Count-
didn't get that position.
Yeah, I mean, the fact that I talked to Republican officials and Central Committee members, I don't see anything wrong with that. But let me say this, in candor, if I and the majority had listened to Republican activists in the county, they would have wanted more than 7 sites, less than 7 sites retained. I mean, if we had listened and took their advice, more than 2 sites would have been changed. They're not happy with what we did.
Okay, so they didn't get all their recommendations, but they got some of their recommendations?
No, these were our recommendations. If we listened to the Republican activists, there would have been many more changes.
The chairman's posting, of course, says support our members
Yes.
in their decision. So he's obviously happy with most of what you did. It is true that a representative of the Young Republicans suggested eliminating Silver Spring and moving it to Leisure World at our public hearing. But we don't see anything wrong with consulting with party officials. We consult with party officials. We just don't do it as a group, and we don't do it as a group leading up to a vote and when they don't appear at a public hearing. And we, I'll talk to anyone who wants to talk about the issues before the board, party officials or not.
Right.
Can I just say one, I know, Tom,
Sure.
about the governor. The executive director of the Democratic Party, Pat Murray, sent out a release criticizing the governor and indicating or inferring that he was involved in some way in this. Absolutely false. Between getting chemotherapy
Yeah.
and running the state, do you think Larry Hogan was concerned about having a voting site in Potomac? Absolutely not. We should pray for the governor and not criticize him.
I think we're all wishing the governor well in his recovery, and Mr. Murray's not here. Can I get back to the decision to close the Praisner Center? I completely understand why you have a responsibility, as I said earlier, to move sites around. Mr. Shalek, do you know how many voters are within 3 miles of the Praisner Center versus within 3 miles of Brookville?
Yes. Well, the state requires a 5-mile radius.
Mm-hmm. And in a dense county like Montgomery County, that really captures a lot of people. But, well, I'll tell you, 5,800 people live within 3 miles of Brookville. 21,000 live within 3 miles of Burtonsville.
Well, look,
That's
we have
4 times greater number live within 3 miles of the Praisner site. So while I understand your desire to move things around and have greater geographic diversity, I think, I'm not sure why then you decide, instead of closing Damascus, the lowest performing, least successful voting site, you close the second most successful and the highest performing one for of-color voters.
Yeah, my figure.
Why was that chosen?
I'm sorry,
Please.
Council. My figures show that Longwood Community Center has 49,378 covered voters within a 5-mile radius. Damascus wasn't closed, one, because it was an existing site selected by a Democrat majority.
So was Praisner.
Correct. I wish we didn't have to. I wish we didn't have to be here. But
Why
Yes,
did
I
you
said-
have to?
Mr. Naaman, he's talking. Would you let him finish, please?
again, we wanted to give it to an area only as a growing area, an important new area growing in our county.
So is East County.
Yes, but we wanted to give it to areas that never had the opportunity. And Damascus has a lot of firefighters and police there, and we were urged to keep it by Delegate Barkley, amongst other reasons.
Okay. Well, we've talked a lot about Praisner. Can we talk about Longwood just for a second? You know the only bus that serves the center is right on Route 53. You can only get there in the morning, and you can only come back in the evening, since there's not a lot of employment going on in Burtonsville. And in Brookville, it's a bedroom community. So for the voters who would normally vote in Praisner, who now have had their early voting site taken away by the board, by the majority of the board, do you know how long it would take them to take a bus from the Praisner site up to Brookville to vote?
I don't
Did you
know.
consider that in your choice?
I don't know the exact time.
You could
frame.
just go to Google Maps and it would tell you. It takes an hour and 26 minutes to take a bus from Burtonsville to Brookville. And
Yeah, but
I'm
don't-
not sure how many voters are going to be committed enough and have the time in their day to spend 3 hours on a bus to get from East County to Brookville.
No, I agree,
But
but
that's
they-
the situation you've now set up.
But Councilman, there's 9 sites from Damascus to Silver Spring that any resident can vote at. They can vote where they work, where they shop. I mean, they're not limited to the one right next to their house. They can go anywhere in the county to vote.
If they have a car, yeah. So many people in East County that rely on that site don't have a car. They rely on public transportation. That's why the site has, in an area of great growth, great population density, and serves the greatest number of voters. And as we said before, it wasn't broke. It was the second highest performing one in the entire county. Finally, I just want to, you mentioned, Mr. Shalek, in an interview I saw, and you mentioned earlier today, that members of the Democratic Party were going to have concerns regardless. I'm not here as a member of the Democratic Party. That's not my concern. My concern isn't that you've erected barriers to Democrats voting. I don't care. That's not what's in the law. That's not what's in Comar. What matters is you've erected barriers to voters voting. You've made it harder for a greater number of voters to vote, and that's against the intent of the law, and I believe the choice of Longwood violates the letter of Comar because of its inaccessibility on public transportation. So I just want to clarify that because I think you have a misunderstanding, or you are repeating a misunderstanding about our concerns. Certainly not my concern. The partisan implications of this, it is that you have barriers to voters voting, which is the opposite of why we passed early voting in the first place. But since you brought up Mr. Higgs, he did say a couple, and you brought up Mr. Murray, I just want to point out, because this confused me. Mr. Higgs says the site they're fighting so hard for, over which is Praisner, is heavily used by residents of Prince George's County? Can residents of Prince George's County vote in Montgomery County?
Yes. Yes, they can.
Uh-huh.
You can vote anywhere in the state
And
at an early voting site.
However, you can only vote a limited portion of the ballot.
right, so you're not voting on Montgomery County offices like all of us, for
No,
example.
but there was some voters from Prince George's County at Burtonsville. It's allowed.
Is that a major concern? Was that a concern of the
No.
majority when you passed this?
No, but
That's the concern of your party chair, with whom you strategized on this secret phone call.
he didn't decide what we're going to do.
Okay.
You know, believe me, if the Republican activists had their way, more than 2 sites would have been chosen.
That just really surprised me because, I mean, my entire district abuts Prince George's County. I have a great relationship with the leadership of Prince George's County, and I don't think we should be vilifying them at all and
No.
you know,
No, it's
criticizing
not,
anybody who wants to vote.
People in Prince George's can vote in any one of our sites, but it's not an issue for us.
But you chose to take it away if apparently that's the stated concern of your party
No,
chair, but you don't agree
the
with
Prince George's accessibility had nothing to do with our consideration.
that. Okay. Just one final question on a question that some of your other members raised, Mr. Shalek. You're in the role of chair now. You have an impressive resume. You've done a lot in your career, and you've been the nominee of your party for state's attorney 3 times, I believe, and for county executive most recently, right? So congratulations. That's a lot of success. The question in my mind, how do you separate your role as a party leader and former chair of the Republican Central Committee? How do you separate? You must be hard to walk into a body that strives to be nonpartisan and knock down barriers for all voters and sort of forget about your leadership. You mentioned earlier that that you're able to do that. You like being chair. Do you see your role as building a bipartisan consensus on controversial matters, or just getting through a majority on votes that are before the board,
No,
regardless of even if they're partisan majorities?
No, my goal is to have a bipartisan board. That's my goal.
How do you
Um,
feel
and
like
I hope
and what grade would you give yourself on that score?
Well, I'd give myself 100%. I don't think David and Mary Ann would, but
Okay.
look, you know,
I think those are my questions, Madam Chair. Thank you.